Before I begin, just a show of hands, how many people here see themselves as data analysts, data scientists? Yeah? How many people see yourself more on the governance side of this equation, the privacy? So you're all here to hear things you already know? This is why you're here? Yeah, okay. So I come from Ohio State, and of course we do have a lot of data at Ohio State, and I always use data in the wrong verb tense. So those of you who get really precious about whether I'm saying data are or data is, I'm going to apologize ahead of time and tell you don't get it wrong. But at Ohio State, as you know, we've got a lot of students, and we do a lot of student data analytics. And when we're doing those student data analytics or MedCenter data analytics or whatever data analytics we're doing, we always have to have questions about why are we doing it, what's the purpose, who's approved it, are we doing it the right way, are we doing it in a secure way, that kind of thing. And in asking those questions, being on the governance side of the house, you always bump into someone who goes, Helen, you're just getting in my way. You're stopping me from doing what I want to do. You're slowing me down. Ugh, right? So I don't like being on the receiving side of that message, but if we're going to fix that problem, we have to fix that problem together. So one of the things I wanted to do today was to talk about that issue, and hopefully collectively, with us all in the room, we can come up with suggestions for one another on how we can not just do really great data scientific analytic work, but how do we do it in a secure, managed, reliable, trustworthy kind of way, okay? So that's what I want to talk about today. This is sort of like when you get on an airplane. If you're planning on coming to this kind of talk, great, you're sitting in the right seat, but if not, you won't offend me if you say, I'm headed out somewhere else right now. So this is your opportunity to leave before we shut the doors and buckle in and fly, okay? All right. It was interesting, my Twitter feed sort of lit up in the last couple of days. The University of Arizona just published an article, the data scientists at the University of Arizona just published an article. They were doing data analytics on student behaviour with the business goal of understanding what kind of behaviour might lead to students dropping out before they graduate in 4 years or 5 years, okay? This is a big deal for higher ed because we get paid federal student aid dollars based on our 4-year and our 5-year graduation rates. So for people like me, who took 15 years to get my undergrad degree, universities hate me, right? So there's a lot of work going on at universities to say, how do we know what our students are doing? How do we know that they're on track to complete 4 or 5 years? How do we know what services to provide them so that they stay engaged and they graduate on time, right? So this data scientist decided that she was going to, and I do say she, and I'm so proud of this, she, but she was going to look at the ID cards that the students at the University of Arizona are issued. And those students, Ohio State does the same thing, most universities do. You get a student card, and you can use that student card to get in and out of buildings, you can get in and out of the gym, you can buy stuff with the card, right? And she hypothesized that if you could see what someone's social circles look like, you can infer how engaged they are at the university, and you can then predict how likely they are to stay engaged and to graduate on time, right? It was a really beautiful piece of data science. It was lovely. And so she looked at data over about 3 years of where people gathered, how often, how strong their social circles were, and she was able to work out to about an 80% accuracy rate who was going to drop out in the first 12 weeks of the semester and who was going to stay. And then they use that data, or they plan to use that data, to give it to student counsellors, right? The students, not happy. Not happy. And especially, and we see this at Ohio State, they know that their data is being analysed for this stuff. They do not like being tracked. People are really sensitive about their location data. And women in particular, by the way, are really sensitive about location data because stalking, right? Right. So where was the governance in that scenario? I'll come back to that scenario as we talk about it. You can Google it. If you Google Arizona University, The Verge, I think, was the magazine that talked about it. You can go take a look. When we govern data, we think about what data do we want to collect? And if you're a data scientist, at least the ones I've dealt with at Ohio State, the answer is give me everything and then I'll work out what I'm going to do with it once I look at it. That sound right? It's reasonable, right? Because you don't know, and you've got to sort of get the context around the data, and yeah, right? So we ask, well, what data are you going to collect? I'll come back to that one in a second. Whose data is it? Whose data is it? So one of the problems we have right now is that in the US, our privacy laws say if you give your data to an organisation, the organisation owns it. Everywhere else in the world, if you give your data to an organisation, the organisation is a custodian of it, but you still own it. And you can imagine then how that changes the dynamic about what data you collect and what you do with that data. Okay? How are you going to get it? This is more around the operations of it, right? Is it a public data source? Is it something where you're going to go and do surveys of individuals, where it's, you know, the what of it? But also, is it core data? Is it inferred data? Is it legal data? You know, is it sensitive? Those kinds of things. How are you going to collect it? And what's your business or legal justification for doing all of that in the first place? Okay? And when we get in pure research environments, this sort of question, when I ask this question of professors and others, they sort of look at me like I have three heads. Like, what do you mean, what's my legal? Because I want it. That's my basis. Right? Again, completely normal if you're an academic to want it that way. It's appropriate. But these are the questions that we have. Yeah? Is everyone following so far? Okay. So here you are, a polyl analyst, and you've got to think about these things. You're surrounded by technology. What technology are you going to use? Is it a Python thing? Is it an R thing? What is it, this thing? You've got the business you've got to work in, unless you're working for yourself, which is it's sort of challenges all on its own, right? But you've got business dynamics. You've got your partners, and these can be data partners where you're going to pull your data from. It could be the sponsor of your research, the person who's actually paying for it. And oh, by the way, if you're using personal data but you've got a public sponsor, who owns the data then? Just, you know, throw that out there. And of course, laws. And all of these wrap around you as you're trying to do this data research. So there are three main roles that I think you need to know. And I'm sure, and I'm open to somebody getting up to the microphone a little bit and saying, Helen, you've got one. But these are the three ones that I see in most companies, big or small, that I want to talk about. By the way, I just randomly tried to pull pictures of people who are in these roles, who are real people in these roles off the internet. Not easy to find pictures of women in any of these roles. Arguably privacy might be easy, but try finding pictures of females in security or different issue for a bit. We start, one of the three roles, first of all, is the data officer. And is anyone here a chief data officer or something like that? Oh, good, okay. There's no one in the room like that. I can talk about that then. No one to challenge me. I think of the data officer as the operational data manager, okay? So this is where you're really sort of, again, trying to work out how do you get the data, how do you process it? Is the definition of an apple the same as an apple, or have we got an apples to marsupials kind of comparison of data going on? What's the data cook like? Those kinds of questions, right? That's your data officer. Privacy. How many of you work for an organisation that has a privacy officer? And if you're from Ohio State, you put your hand down because we don't. And if you're worried about that, you should be, by the way. Okay, so privacy officers are really about representing, this is where it gets sort of confusing in the US, representing the company about how to represent the individuals whose data it is. You think you've got a complicated job, try being a privacy officer. Okay, so we talk about approvals, consent. If you're in Europe, the right to be forgotten, right? The right for your data to be corrected, those kinds of issues falls under privacy. And then the one I know best, security. Okay? So this is about, are we doing things in a secure way, protecting the data, protecting the systems the data sits on, those kinds of questions. Does this make sense in terms of what these three roles are? Pretty straightforward? Okay. They overlap. This is where it starts getting really annoying when you're an analyst, because they overlap. So if you are in a bigger company and you've got all of these three roles and you've got a question in that overlap space, it's sometimes hard to know who's on first. Yeah? So we all care about protecting data, but we're all coming at it through a different lens, all three of us. So the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, that's me, we care about protecting the data and the systems, but we're not asking those questions like, should we have the data? Or is our definition of this data correct? We're just saying, is the data protected? Do we have access controls? Is it available when we need it to be available? Can we rely on the data from an integrity point of view? That's the CISO one, okay? The privacy officer, though, talks about, again, should we have the data? Are we approved to have the data? Are we approved to have the data for the purpose we have the data? Two different questions, by the way, wrapped up in one really bad grammatical sentence. And then the Chief Data Officer, again, how do you use it? So this is where we're the same, but we're a little different too. Security is a process, okay? So we care about these themes of confidentiality and integrity and availability, the CIA triad, right? The real goal here is to make sure that the systems we have and the data we have behave as we expect them to behave. That's unique to being a security officer, right? The data officer, this is more of a tool. It's process-centered, but it's really around the tool. What tools are you using to do your data manipulation? What tools are you doing to decide what is the data cookbook and what the definitions of that data are, okay? You deal with things like, how do we process data at speed? How do we process data at volume? How do we process data or analyze data that's structured versus unstructured? Security doesn't care, privacy doesn't care about that stuff. The Chief Data Officer and the operational pieces, they care about it. Does that make sense? Okay. Privacy, though, is a right. It's not a process, it's not a tool, it's a right. It's around the people, right? So are we anonymizing our data? Are we really anonymizing our data? If you go back to that Arizona example, the scientist said, don't you worry, that data is anonymized, but then in the next breath said, and the way we're going to use the data is to tell the advisors who's likely to drop out. Well, how anonymized is your data if you can do that, right? All of these things, right? It's a legal and compliance issue often. This is about privacy statements, right? And consent to use. But what do we have in common? All of these roles have to work with these groups. One of the questions that as an analyst you should be asking yourself is, if I don't do what the privacy officer tells me to do, that I have to do, or the security officer, or the data officer, what are the consequences? And sometimes, depending on the company you work for, the consequence is you get fired. Sometimes the consequence is you go to jail, right? Sometimes the consequence is you pay a fine, right? But all of these pieces of your organisation support security, privacy, and operations. So the people who are in those roles have to be able to communicate and partner with these pieces of the organisation, whether they're an individual who has a title or whether it's just a function if you're in a smaller organisation. These are some of the things that you have to think about when you're in those roles. Okay? There are also roadblocks. There are also roadblocks. We all know that it's all about speed to market these days. It's all about we need the data yesterday. Someone's going to die if I don't get this data analysis on some cancer thing done, right? It's all about speed to market. And so these structures and these governance structures that are there to not only protect the individuals whose data it might be, or the company, they're there to protect you as an analyst, slows you down. We recognise that. Slows you down. So what can we do about it? First of all, I'm going to suggest to you that a little bit of slowdown is okay. And I will also tell you that thanks to the Equifax breach, thanks to the incoming EU Global Data Protection Regulations, which is a privacy regulation, they will slow you down, and that will be the new normal. If it's not already. Does it feel like it's already the normal for you guys, that you're getting slowed down? Yeah, great. It is. Because 20 years ago, when I started, when Lisa and I started, way back when, right? People were on mainframes, and the data was on the mainframe. It was in one spot, and when you left work, you went home and you didn't connect to the mainframe, and the data was there and it was protected, right? So we came up with these network and moat kind of security things around it. No one was thinking privacy because it was a pain in the ass to try and get this mainframe to talk to that mainframe and do data analytics. We just did it, right? And now people are carrying around a whole freaking data center on their mobile device, right? So this is the new normal. We're going to have to think about it. I'm sure, how many of you got that Equifax thing? Yeah. How many of you have had a thing from a doctor or a medical center that said, oh, we're sorry, we lost your data? Right? So society, the conventional wisdom of society is we're starting to wake up to privacy is important, security is important, and what really worries me as a security person is when we're going to see problems with data related to artificial intelligence and machine learning that are going to reinforce societal injustice and not solve for it. So how we manage our data, how we govern our data, is part of what the New World Order really is. So if you're working in that, your goal now is not to get rid of that oversight and say, Helen, go take a walk. Your job is to say, how can we work together so we can be as efficient and effective as we can be, so that the end result is trustworthy. Because if we don't trust the data, I don't care how great your analysis is, it's not going to be worth the time you put into it. And all of those roles, the operations manager, the privacy manager, the security manager, they're there to make your work trustworthy. Yeah? So I'm going to suggest to you that in order to make that efficient and effective, you have to have a shared culture at your organisation that believes that those governance structures make you better. Now, if you don't, that's fine. Don't work for a company. Work for yourself. Take all the risks on yourself. Live or die by it by yourself, that's fine. But if you're going to do collaborative data analysis, you have to build a trustworthy environment to do it. Big or small, trustworthy is the only way to go. So you want to make sure that everybody that works in that environment, whether you're the analyst or whether you're the governance group, are as reliable and trustworthy as they can be. Ethics is sort of the thing, right? So there's ways you can do it. If you're an analyst, take classes on some of these topics. I mean, you're all here. Yay, good start, right? But there's a ton of things out there, there are a ton of organisations out there that will help you learn basic concepts, basic things to know about security or privacy or operations. It's sort of like our current MBAs. How many of you have an MBA? How many of you took a class about security in that MBA program? Right. How many, the answer was none, by the way. How many of you took a privacy class in your MBA program? Great. How many of you took a data analytics class in that MBA program? Yay! Okay, so we told people how to manipulate data, and we put no bumpers around that in terms of should they, can they, right? We haven't quite got some of those basic educational structures in place yet around this. So you're going to have to go find them in the private sector. I'm sorry, University of Cincinnati, do we have anybody here from Cincinnati? They've got a great program, by the way. I'm going to say that about Ohio State. No, I can't say that about Ohio State in some areas, right? But Cincinnati, good job, yeah? Here in Columbus State, good job, okay? Find the people in your organisation who do this. Again, they may not have the title of security or privacy officer. It might be network administrator. It might be lawyer, right? Take them to lunch. Let them know that you care about it. Let them know that you're interested in it, and they will reciprocate. Because we all know that I don't care how big the organisation is, things get done through relationship, not through process. Yeah? So, build that culture if you can. We also have to make sure in the life cycle of your data analytics work that you're thinking about these things at the beginning and not at the end. And that means, by the way, if you're Agile Scrum, that you're thinking about it all the freaking time, right? But shift left when you think about this. In the beginning, before you go, hey, I've just spent 2,000 hours coming up with this great thing, isn't it great? And then the privacy officer goes, no, you can't do that. Go to the privacy officer in the beginning and say, I'm thinking about doing this thing, what do you think? Right? They will save you a lot of rework if you shift left in your processes. Okay? Some things there if you're a company. For the analyst, it's really great to know R. We just had a great talk about how to use R. But also know how do you use security tools to evaluate the quality of your code. How do you use security tools to scan for things that don't comply with your privacy policy? Those kinds of things. By the way, the biggest reason that companies get fined for violating privacy in the US is not because they lose data. It's because their privacy policy says, we do things really, really well, and then it turns out that they don't. Yeah? So, know how to use the tools that validate that you are doing things in a secure way or a private way, right? Talk to your project leads about this. If you're in a company that's big enough where you've got, anyone here a project manager, a program manager? Yeah. You too can take security and privacy classes. I expect you to be bringing this up as part of your work plan analysis. But if you have a project manager who is not doing that, make sure you can take a leadership role and ask them to do that, okay? And again, keep talking about what you're doing. Be transparent about what you're doing, which is really hard if you're in a market where you're trying to protect your intellectual property and not tell too many people about what you're doing. But you've got to find that trusted group of people that you can work with, internal to your company, your confidants, and get somebody into that circle who knows security or privacy or operations or whatever you need to do. Okay? Again, it comes back to training for a lot of people. One of the things that I find particularly frustrating is that we have boards of trustees who know nothing about this, and they're being asked to make risk decisions about your data analytics work, and they know nothing about this. So think of training is going to depend on where you are in your career. If you are just starting out, get all technical weedy on it. That's fine. If you're sort of middle management or above, go talk to your lawyer or somebody. I guarantee you there's a ton of lawyers out there that would be happy to charge you to talk to you about privacy and security stuff. But they're there and you should have a chat with them about it. Okay? Find one of those people to be a mentor. If you're like me and you sort of have a stable of mentors and all of them bring different skills to your career, find someone who's security or privacy or operations manager level and add them to your mentor list, because it is one of those skills. Just like finance is a skill you're going to need, or management skills, if you want to run a team, you will not work in this economy if you don't understand security and so forth. Right? So get them in there. The whole point of all of this is that your governance people can trust you in what you're doing, and you can trust them, and people then don't point fingers at one another when things go wrong, right? You've got to build up that bank of trust so that when things go wrong, because they will, that you've got each other's back. And that's why you need to do these kinds of things. This is why I would suggest to you that it will be easier for you if you do these kinds of things than if you ignore it. So this is where we're headed. So we can ask these questions of who, what, why, how, when, sometimes, supporting one another and trusting one another. So if we go back to that Arizona case, which of those areas do you think fell down that they published this and there was this uproar from students?
Privacy.
Privacy for the students, absolutely. What else?
The data collection method.
The data collection method, yeah. So the data operations side of it. They may have been able to get that data through another channel and not sort of hit on that locational issue perhaps as being such a hot topic. Maybe. Yeah. What's that? The authorization side, yep. So that's privacy. I would also guess, I don't know yet, I'm still watching to see it play out, that probably, because I know this is sort of how it works at universities, researchers go off and do their own thing and then they tell leadership, hey, look at this cool thing I did. Yeah? So I'm also guessing that there was probably not quite the governance over this particular research initiative that maybe there should have been. But I don't know that for sure, so you can't quote me on that in a court of law. Okay? Does this make sense to everybody? So this is pretty well what I've got for you. I'm hoping that we can spend most of the time talking with each other. Does anybody have questions or comments? Yes?
So what has been one of the most effective ways to communicate security around some of these technologies that hold the data?
Yeah.
It's not always easy considering sometimes you're speaking to a privacy or a legal team that might not understand the technology that's holding the data.
Yeah. So the question is, what's some effective ways to talk about privacy or security with people who may not understand it? Did I paraphrase that about right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I found more effective. I'm not saying they're perfect. One is do lots of storytelling. So I will tell you that breaches like Equifax are the gift that keeps on giving, because everyone's been touched, like they have an emotional reaction to it. Some people they're just like, I don't care, it's my social and my driver's license and my work history and my mortgage information, but hey, it's already out there anyway, I don't care. There are some people who are like that. And then there are some people who are really sort of personally offended that Equifax even had their data in the first place and nobody gave them permission to have their data. And so you've got these wide ranges. But using real examples that touch on the individuals. I'll tell you what's getting OSU researchers right now, by the way. The federal government is saying if you don't comply with security policies, we're going to yank your research funding. Nothing gets researchers more attention than letting them know that their funding is about to go out the door, right? So I'm not saying scare them, but I am saying use real life examples. The other thing I would say is use personal examples. It's much more visceral for people to think about how their kids' information might be taken, or their personal safety might be an issue, or those kinds of things, than it is about worrying about whether or not the company makes their quarterly projections, earnings projections, right? So make it as personal as you can be. Storytelling helps. Absolutely. Great question. Yeah?
Yeah. Okay. My question is, right now I have a lot of smart data scientists, right? With the open data source with open tools.
Mm-hmm.
The sky almost unlimited, and they can do anything they want, script data anywhere they want.
Yeah.
So, do you have any recommendation on the process or policies or way to work with them so we don't limit the capability to do the research exploration, but also put guardrail and so or some process so we don't have disaster happen afterwards?
Yeah. I think a couple of things. One, have a sense of what data you really feel is sensitive and important and what data is not. And I know it's really easy to go to, well, social security numbers are regulated and therefore they're important and other data isn't. But we've got to think more broadly than that. And I think this is where the EU data protection regulation is starting to make us think that way. So it might be that someone's medical data, not HIPAA, because HIPAA is about medical records and billing, that medical data might be sensitive enough that you say to them, yep, take this open source software, do whatever with it, but don't use sensitive data while you're playing around with it. So give some thought to that ahead of time. I would also have them think about what's the worst thing that could happen if we lost the data or it was stolen, right? Someone modified the data while we were doing the research. So one of the things that really worries me is what if someone hacks into some researcher's data store and changes that data and we don't know it, because it's not like when someone steals your TV, you don't know that it's sort of not on the wall anymore, right? What if someone modifies the data and then we go and do clinical trials based on that flawed data, right? So think about what happens if we lose it or it's stolen, but what happens if someone modifies it and we don't know? What's the worst that can happen? And then work backwards from that. In risk analysis language, that is, let's do some threat modeling first. So again, thinking about what can you do early in the process rather than later. Early in the process, do a little bit of threat modeling, and that will make you think about, should we? Right? That's where I would start. The tools themselves, whether open source or internally developed, I'm a little bit apolitical on that because I think there's as much likelihood of it being bad code if it's internally developed than if it's open source. Right? And some people say, no, Helen, with everyone's eyes on it for open source, it's probably better. Except that everyone just copies and pastes open source stuff. So if it's bad to start with, it's propagated everywhere bad, right? So again, what tools can you use to scan your code to make sure that it doesn't have flaws in it, vulnerabilities in it, malware in it, those kinds of things? Do it first before you push stuff into production. Yeah. Does that answer that question, or did I miss the mark on it? So, okay. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, there's a microphone coming.
So let's say you get a hold of a project, or you hear about a project that is just on the way, it's going to be great research, you're getting ready to be published, and then you notice you didn't follow, or there's some risk here.
Yeah.
How do you work, I guess, with the business owner to kind of mitigate that and put the brakes on in a way that kind of saves the relationship, so you're not seen as the roadblock?
Yeah.
How do you manage those kinds of situations?
So ultimately, whether or not somebody publishes data or goes into production with product is not my risk to assume. My risk in the governance role is to sort of act more like a mirror. Oh, by the way, I'm seeing this. Now you as the business owner make the call, right? So it's not my job to tell them they can't, or they shouldn't, or they whatever. It is my job to say, it's my professional opinion that this is a risk that could cause good things to happen, because there's certainly risk of not doing good things, right? But it could also cause bad things to happen, and have we weighed that appropriately? And depending on the size and scope of that risk, you might just say, you know, I'm just telling you this, but you, the manager who's just in the middle of the organisation, you can make that call. Or it might be something that ultimately could really infect the whole company, and then it's got to go further up the chain. So it depends on the size of the risk that's involved. Now, hopefully, if you're in a big enough company like that, you've got those levels of escalation already predefined, so you don't have to just do it ad hoc when stuff happens. Not, especially small companies that are growing, they often don't have that structure already in place, so you've just got to use your best judgment at that point and go, no, this could be a really big shit deal, I'm going to tell the boss, or it's make your call. I'm just letting you know this is a thing. Now, I say that having worked for 10 years at JP Morgan, and JP Morgan was sort of more like a game, right? So it was like, no, there's some algorithm and you just flipped into the red zone and you're not moving forward, and then it's not a risk decision, it's a process decision. So it just depends on sort of the culture of your organisation, how structured you really need to be. Yeah. Ownership's a big sort of weird question, right? So at Ohio State, for example, you know, every college or unit or independent researcher is really assuming risk on behalf of the institution, right? And they want it that way. That's sort of the academic freedom kind of thing. But when the proverbial hits the fan, it's not Professor X in the College of Psychobotany did something wrong. It's Ohio State did something wrong. So you've got to balance the reputational of the whole organisation against the decisions of a few. And that can be challenging. I wish I had an answer for that. I haven't got it completely yet. Other questions?
So what are the different data governance initiatives that need to happen in a big data space?
Yeah, good question. How do I answer that question? Does anyone have an answer to that question? Has anyone seen anything that's worked? That's a serious question. Has anyone seen anything that's worked? I don't think that there's a conventional wisdom around that, because this whole, especially in the big data space, people still don't know. How many of you can, like, on 30 seconds or less, define what big data actually is?
Huge volume, variety.
It's a big pile of data, right? Yeah. So there isn't, we haven't got, as an industry, as a society, we haven't got the structures around this where I could go, oh yeah, that's just that. I think you've got to start, you're going to have to take it from where you are in your, either yourself, if it's just you, or in your organisation, and just start having conversations around it, right? What are we willing to do? What are we not willing? It's going to, again, it will depend. Are you in medical bioscience kind of data analytics? Are we trying to work out what the price of shoes should be? What's the consequence of getting data wrong in both of those environments, right? So it's going to depend on what the context of your environment is. I would just say start having conversations about it with leadership team, and then you can work out how structured you want to be. A lot of, especially startups, they want to be really, really nimble. And that's great, and I don't want to get in the way of that. So how do you build the structures to allow them to be as nimble as possible, but you're not overlooking those data governance questions? Yeah. I wish I had an answer for that. I'd make $1 million, but I don't.
So you touched on this with data ownership, but how does it work with when academia works with companies?
Yeah.
Who assumes the risk in that situation, or is it co-owned by the two?
It depends on the contract. This is why lawyers are your friend. It always depends. Well, actually, there's 2 or 3 pieces. And for anyone who's in higher ed, by the way, if you feel the need to add on or disagree with something I say, feel free. Typically, it's the contract if it's a sponsored research project. So if Cardinal's coming to Ohio State and saying, we want you to do X, the T's and C's of that contract should say who owns the data, whatever. But it depends where the data comes from as well. So there may be other regulatory agencies and so forth that have ownership on that data if that's where you're getting it from. That it doesn't matter who you're doing research with or what your partners are, you're still accountable, even if you're not the owner, you're accountable for making sure that things are done according to whatever guidelines that they require. So it gets really confusing. And heaven help you that it's data provided by the government, used to sponsor by a sponsored program person about individuals. Who owns that? Columbus Smart City. Anyone here working with Columbus Smart City stuff?
Partners with them.
Partners with it. Can you imagine that, like that kind of stuff? Who owns that data, right? If I ride CODA from the convention centre up to OSU, and now they've got data on the fact that I was on that bus, and they want to use that for data analytics to improve health outcomes in the city, perfectly good business case for that. Is that the city's data? Is that my data? Is that the Department of Transportation who's sponsoring the Smart City grants? I don't know. It's really complicated. I love it when you go to a conference and the speakers can't actually answer your question. What about that?
I'm wondering if you're seeing any trends for a new chief ethics officer.
Yeah, actually, yes. Typically, you're going to see it in established industries where they've had a big regulatory smackdown, right? What I am seeing is a trend towards not having 3 or 4 of these chief whatever officers and having one, I don't know what we'll call it, chief data officer that is responsible for privacy and operations and security, and it's just one. And typically they don't report into the operational arm of the organisation. They're going to report directly to the board, or they're going to report directly to the president or whatever, because they need the opportunity to be able to be independent from day-to-day operational decisions and decision making. So you are starting to see this question of data governance consolidate into one data governance organisation that covers all of these, because there is too much overlap between these domains for everybody else to try and interface with all of these groups. It's crazy. Yeah. But I don't know. I would think we would self-regulate ethics, but maybe that's rainbows and unicorns. I'm not sure. Other questions?
In smaller organizations, like what you are talking about is big scale organizations.
Yeah, right.
In smaller SMEs or smaller organizations, how where they don't have the luxury of a data officer or
Yeah.
something of that sort,
Yep.
who would take these roles? Who exactly would do this sort of a thing?
Probably no one is yeah. Yes, and then it comes down to the analyst, and this is why I'm saying I would recommend that you make sure somebody in the organisation is taking training, so that there is somebody that you can go ping an idea or a question off of, even if it's not their full-time job to be a security person or a privacy person or whatever. But somebody who has that sort of skill set, even if they do something else as a full-time job, I would start there. I would also suggest that what smaller companies are focusing on first at the moment tends to be security. Because operationally they're not so big and complicated that they're running into how-to kind of questions. And they haven't got to the point where they care about privacy, because privacy is not quite as regulated. Someone's going to disagree with me, but I think privacy in general, most privacy regulations have both a security component to it and a privacy component to it, which is also very annoying to everybody, right? But it's the security side of those privacy regs that they get fined on. So you're starting to see smaller companies focus first on security, then the operational part comes into play once they get big enough that they're tripping over their own feet, and then privacy comes along after that. Is typical of. Does anyone have a difference of opinion on that matter? I'm not saying I'm the expert there, but does that sound right?
I have another question for you.
Yes.
On the same grounds.
Uh-huh.
For example, the email policy of a company is defined, right?
Yeah.
The email policy says that the employee's information is his own information, but it's still based on the HR policy or whatever, it still says that the email is accessible to the HR and it's not his personal property.
Uh-huh.
But that actually is, when you think of it, it is his intellectual capital that goes in the emails and things like that. It's his own experience that's used in the company.
Do you work at a university?
No.
Okay. So I will tell you that in most private companies I've worked for or I know about, there is no statement that says company email is you can consider it to be private or personal. And in some cases, companies, they won't let you use it for personal use. Now, at Ohio State, we say you can, within limits, use it for personal use, but you cannot expect privacy when you do, right? And I think in a corporate setting, that's how that is. Yeah. The challenge is if you let, and by the way, it's sort of a sore topic for me right now, so again, if we do happy hour later and you want to climb me with alcohol, I'll be the outside. The concern I have for employees who treat corporate email as their own personal email box is that it can be, if there's a legal case, whether that's a harassment case or a public records request or an anything kind of thing, then if they're using their personal email, that entire email box is subject to review. And no one wants that, right? So note to self, don't put personal emails in your work email, and don't put work email in your personal email. Keep them separate. I know it's a pain in the ass, but keep it separate, and then you'll all be happy.
All right.
Any other questions?
We're actually
Out of time.
We are.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.